All right. How you guys doing? um, so I love, you guys know I generally love sharing my epiphanies with you guys. And I had one today. I had an epiphany. Um, it was crazy because my epiphany kind of happened all at once. And my epiphany was this. Um, for a while, I had been kind of attacking sublimation as a concept. And this is where like the violence of thought kind of happens. What do I mean by like the violence of thought? It means like you you attack the concept rather than trying to see it, like trying to see it, if that makes any sense. And so I'll give you an example of like how I attacked the notion of like sublimation. Like, so the the way I attacked sublimation itself was like, okay, so the way I'm understanding sublimation is that the Hegelian sublimation is this, right? That there's a kind of like preserving, elevating simultaneously, right? And the reason why I was attacking this was because, well, you know, if you're saying that there's a preservation and an elevation at the same time, I was arguing that retroactively this negates the preservation, and that means it's just an excess. It's just an excess of this. It is just excess itself. Like that means sublimation itself is just sort of non-existent by virtue of its like retroactive negation. Um, and then also what kind of benefited me from saying this was like borrowing from Derrida's critique on, but he had a different critique on like the origin, where it's like the very fact of you looking back and realizing that was a limit is already obscured by the aftermath of looking back. So like that limit that you're looking back on is already obscured by virtue of the aftermath. So like whatever language or understanding that you have of looking back at that limit is already obscured because it's after the limit that you realize it was a limit. Um, and so I was attacking sublimation from that point of view. Uh, but you can see what happened today was that randomly, I guess I must have like absorbed this unconsciously somehow. I started remembering my talk with Daniel, which you guys will see Friday. My talk with Daniel that will appear Friday. There was a line that Daniel said where he said, sublimation, like he said, philosophy should be rooted in life. It should be rooted in life to where such a that we can actually experience it. Um, Correct me if I'm wrong, Daniel. Yeah, Daniel said something like that to that degree. Anyways, um, I'm like driving, and then suddenly I get this thought about sublimation, and then that thought goes into another thought. And I remember, learning about sublimation in the sense of exactly what I said before, right? There's this kind of simultaneous preservation, elevation. And for some reason, my mind went straight to the political order, right? Republicans and Democrats, right? And what do we typically symbolically associate um, Republicans with is a kind of conservative preservation, right? They're trying to preserve values. And you could say liberals are trying to ascend those values. They're trying to make new values and promote new values. So already I said, oh, wow, that is the sublimation taking in that's like the sublimation process, basically, right? This preservation elevation. but it's the sublimation taking in effect. It's not that there's actual sublimation, but it's taking in effect here. You can see how there's a dialectic going on. Um, and then and then my readings on anxiety started connecting too, where for Freud, anxiety is something that is simultaneously a kind of self-defense mechanism and then also kind of like looking towards the future. So you can already see how there's a sublimation taking in effect even with anxiety, where it's like anxiety activates defense mechanisms, the preservation, and then yet simultaneously you want to be raised up, right? Because there's that raising up of looking towards the future, of wanting to overcome those, you know, self-defense mechanisms, right? And then I started thinking about nature. And I'm like, well, what's ironic about nature is like literally every single thing has a kind of self-defense mechanism. Now, the defense mechanisms for everything in our world is rather very specific. Like, certain berries are toxic to us as a sort of self-defense mechanism, but they're not toxic to other animals, right? But they can be specifically toxic for us. So it's interesting that there's things in reality, in nature, that they have a kind of self-defense mechanism, a kind of preservation, but they have a kind of self-preservation in order to elevate, uh, and in order to thrive. So I guess what I'm trying to say is when I had this, I guess, epiphany about sublimation, I understood immediately what the violence of thought means. The violence of thought, in my opinion, is when we attack the concept for itself, right? For itself. And that's essentially what I had done previously. I was attacking sublimation for itself. But sublimation cannot be understood for itself. And that's kind of like the realization I had today when I had this epiphany of literally seeing it in nature, and seeing how there is this simultaneous thing happening with plants, with people, with anything, that there's a kind of preservation element and then also an elevation element. And just for psychological terms, you can call these defense mechanisms of any sort. These are kind of the preservation, and the fact that typically, fundamentally, we always want to preserve ourselves, but then there's something more that eludes that preservation. It's not just preservation, there's something more to it. And that something more is that very notion of elevation that is constantly in tension with um, those preserving instincts, or whatever we want to call them. So, but to give another example of like the violence of thought, I will kind of show you what the violence of thought looks like. So today I wrote a piece on mutuality, and the impossibility of it. And I said something along the lines of, having a criteria for the other, for a mutuality, actually obscures the other, right? So you trying to have a sense of like, oh, is this mutual between me and this person? So therefore, in order for me to know if it's mutual, I'm going to construct some type of method, some type of test, for me to know if it's mutual. And in my argument in the essay, I say, well, if you do that, whether they abide to it or not, basically you are covering over them. Like you are erasing the other by virtue of that fact, right? And then so I say, in response, I say the best thing that we can do is to not like have this criteria, or a test or instrument of test to figure out whether it's mutual or not, because obviously once you do that, you obscure the other by virtue of doing so. Because fundamentally, if they do assimilate themselves to your criteria, all you get is a semblance of them via through your criteria. So basically, like it's them, but obfuscated by your criteria, right? So you never really encounter them in their sort of wholeness and fullness, right? Now, here's the rebuttal, but this rebuttal would be a violence of thought, for example. So when I say, "Oh, there should be no criteria for the other," somebody could say, "Well, isn't that a criteria? No criteria for the other, so therefore you already contradicted yourself," and yada 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 yada. Yada. Yes, yes, that's true. However, you see how the the very allowance of this open-ended criteria of just allowing the other to be other um, is it is a criteria, right? It is a criteria by the logic of thought, but it really isn't when it's in that experience of witnessing and experiencing the other, or letting the other be other. So it's not really it's not really a criteria, right? You're actually My argument would be that you're actually letting the criteria unfold itself. But then again, the violence of thought will always say, well, isn't that a criteria? Isn't that itself a criteria? And see, this is what's difficult, is because what's happening in understanding this is that we are attacking the concept, right? We are attacking the concept rather than the context to which the concept is trying to explain, which is the other, right? How do we encounter the other in its most truest way? So, yes, even though no criteria is a criteria according to thought, right? It really isn't in the living of that criteria, if that makes any sense. And so that's why I was like, the violence of thought is very hard to catch because, even saying like, I don't have a position, and then thought says, oh, but it is a position because no position is a position. Like there is a violence of thought being done. Obviously, it's not intentional, at least in my experience. For most people, it wasn't intentional um, with myself, but there is a violence of thought being done in that kind of thinking. Again, like I said, I don't believe it's intentional. I genuinely think most people are, trying to genuinely think, but what ends up happening is you attack the concept rather than the context from which it's taking place. And so that's why I think it's different when we see the concept versus think the concept. Because if you think the concept, you'll start going, well, like, wait a second, isn't sublimation like, doesn't it kind of like negate itself by virtue of the fact that it preserves, elevates, and then wouldn't that retroactive effect already erase the preservation because you're looking back? And when you look back, you already obscure the origin by virtue of looking back because you are stuck in an aftermath discourse, and and so on and so on, and this can go back on. But you see, what I didn't see was that there's one key word. The one key word is simultaneous. Simultaneous. It's simultaneous preservation and elevation. And thinking, thinking cannot think simultaneous. It has to witness simultaneous. It has to live simultaneous. And in that moment, right, the only way that I could actually see simultaneous was looking at opposites, right? So when I looked at the the political party structure for the US, I was like, oh, look at this: preservation, Republicans; elevation, liberals; sublimation. Right? I could not see it in a single thing, but when you're looking at opposites, you can see it, and it happens. It is simultaneous with. So when I started thinking that, I'm like, oh, so that means, when you look at a flower or you look at a plant, you understand that there's a self there is a self defense mechanism taking place, and then also an elevation mechanism taking place. And the same thing with us human beings. And actually, I would argue that probably anxiety is that exact sublimation taking in effect. That